Then he built other things as well. St. Louis began to rue the day that Holcomb and Elwell had said, "You're not welcome." They could see that Alma was beginning to prosper in ways that they had never expected. So Mr. Wright started pouring his money into Alma, and some of the things he did created quite a lot of hard feelings between the towns. And I'm going to tell you about 4 events that happened concurrently. They were just layered on top of each other. They happened in the mid-1880s. And it doesn't matter what order I tell you these 4 stories, but they were all happening about the same time. The first was the arrival of the Ann Arbor Railroad. The Ann Arbor rails were coming from Owasso to Ithaca. Remember your map? Ithaca, right here in the middle? The rails were coming up to Ithaca. And there they were going to stop for a bit while they did some money raising. And they raised money by coming here to St. Louis and saying, if you want the rails to come here, you have to subscribe to $25,000 for us to come to St. Louis. Well, St. Louis had a railroad right here behind us that came in from Saginaw, and so they had rail connections. And finally some of the town fathers said, yeah, but it would be really great to have the Ann Arbor Railroad because that one comes in from the south. So they came up with the money. And so the rails came up to the south part of town, down by where the industrial park is, and there they stopped because the Ann Arbor had run out of money again. They had to go and sell more railroad bonds and raise money before they could make any progress, and they intended to go from here to Mount Pleasant, and obviously then on to Clare, and they were stalled. Well, Mr. Wright over in Alma's thinking, well, I don't really want the Ann Arbor Railroad to miss Alma, and there had been a road from Alma, a railroad from Alma down to Ithaca. It was a stub road. It was a dead end. It just went down and gave Ithaca rail connections. And Ithaca was excited about that, and that was on the west side of town. Ann Arbor was out on the east side of town, and so people began to think, okay, if there's a road from Ithaca to Alma, why wouldn't the Ann Arbor pick that up and improve it and make it into the main line? But by then, St. Louis had bought the rails, and they were here. They weren't downtown, but they were close. Well, that was a worry for the people of St. Louis. They felt a little secure in that they had paid to have the railroad come. Mr. Wright went to New York City where he had connections, and he had a lot of credit, and he raised money and began building a railroad from Alma to Forest Hill to Shepherd, hinting it was going to Mount Pleasant. It was supposed to start in Lansing, but of course he only said that. He never intended it to do that. It was called the Lansing, Alma, and Mount Pleasant Railroad, L-A-M-P, the Lamp Road. And it was under construction while the rails were just down here, a little ways away. Well, the Ann Arbor Railroad interests were furious. They were upset because they were stalled. They couldn't go across the mill pond. They wanted to put a trestle across and keep moving. Now they said, it's pointless to put a rail line from St. Louis to Mount Pleasant and compete with that one. They had a little talk and decided that yes, the rails down here would make a curve and go across the river, picking up an old railroad grade, go across the north side of Alma, make another curve, and hook into the new Lamp Road. And Mr. Wright became a director of the Ann Arbor Railroad. And so that was what happened, and it made a timetable for engineers very, very tough because you're making these curves all the time, and they didn't like it. And because of that, St. Louis was still worried that they might lose the railroad. That's number one. Number two, Mr. Wright had been in Saratoga Springs. He also knew about the mineral spy here in St. Louis, and on State Street in Alma, he began construction of the Alma Springs Sanitarium. Drilled a well, got water, mineral water, didn't have magnetic qualities, but that didn't matter. This was a 3-story building that later was added on to a 4-story, 5-story addition. People came from all over the Midwest to take the cure. So you had 2 competing spas, 3 miles apart, And there was no question in the minds of St. Louis people why he built that spa. It was to run direct competition to the spa here in the Magnetic Mineral Springs in the Park Hotel. And so that created some very hard feelings also, so things were kind of building up. Then, number 3, Mr. Wright looked at his tax bill. Now, back then, if you lived in a town, you paid taxes to the township. And we're in what was Bethany Township, now the city of St. Louis, but it was Bethany Township back then. But when you look across at the cars parked across the street, they're in Pine River Township. Okay? That's the township line. And the same thing happens in Alma. Superior Street is the township line. And all the businesses and residents on the north side were part of Pine River Township. Those on the south side are part of Arcata Township. Mr. Wright said, when I compare my tax bill to what people in St. Louis are paying on comparable property, I'm being ripped off. And he had the figures to show it. And he went to Mr. Woods, the assessor, who lived out just, I think, west of town. He was a Pine River Township resident, but really tied in with St. Louis, and he begged him, and Mr. Woods wouldn't do anything about it. So Mr. Wright had connections, too, in Lansing. So he went to Lansing and sent somebody to talk to probably a representative, and he had introduced in the House a bill that would annex the north half of Alma into Arcata Township. Oh, can you imagine what happened when that news hit Pine River Township in St. Louis? They were going to lose all the taxes that they were getting from half of Alma. Well, Mr. Wood, the assessor, was also the state rep. And he went down to Lansing for a session, and he was in the House chamber going from desk to desk saying, vote this down, vote this down. If this goes through, I am finished. I'll never get reelected. And he's walking around, and they call for the vote. And they voted, and he wasn't even at his desk. Suddenly, the vote was there, and it failed. Whoa! Whew. Mr. Wood was a happy man. He came back to Pine River Township, and he was a hero in Pine River Township and in St. Louis, and you know, he'd put one over on Amy Wright at last. Everything was fine now, except sitting in the gallery that day at the vote was a man named General Nathan Church from Ithaca. I don't know why he was there, but on the way back to Ithaca, he probably took the train to Durand and then came up through Owasso to Ithaca. He got to thinking, well, the figures prove that Mr. Wright's being ripped off, and General Nathan Church had just built a business block, a big building that still stands in Alma, and he was on the south side of Superior Street, so he didn't have any vested interest in this really because his property was in Arcata Township, but he thought they didn't do the right thing. So he came from Ithaca up to talk to the Pine River Township authorities and St. Louis authorities, and he said, why don't you just do the right thing? We can see by comparison that, you know, Mr. Wright's paying more taxes than his share. Make it right. And they went, oh, we're going to tax him however we want. Well, General Nathan Church went back to Ithaca, and he was upset, not because he had been snubbed, but because they refused to do what he considered to be the right thing. Then he discovered that while once the vote had been taken, you could not reintroduce the bill that day and vote on it again. Now you could put the bill back through, and so it was arranged to put the bill before the House again. That time they explained with figures and everything about the discrepancy between the taxing here and there, and they voted, and Mr. Wood is down there just cowering in his chair, afraid of what's going to happen, and rightfully so, because it happened. That time it passed, and suddenly 2 square miles of the north side of St. Louis